The bayous of Louisiana in the final days of September 2024 still held a rich and peaceful tranquility. In a small, unincorporated community in St. Martin Parish, the hazy late afternoon sun cast a golden hue on the towering cypress trees, their Spanish moss glinting over the murky canals that fed the crawfish ponds. Life here flowed quietly, tied to the rhythm of the tides and the smell of mud and vegetation. But in this stillness, a horrifying secret that had been buried for 5 years was about to be dragged from the muddy depths by a fateful fishing hook. 15-year-old Leo Boudreau sat perched on an old wooden stool on the edge of the pond. This large catfish pond, located just behind his family's garden, was his private world. Every afternoon after school, he would cast his simple bamboo rod, the bobber floating lazily on the murky water surface, his mind at ease as he waited. Suddenly, the bobber jerked violently and then plunged beneath the water. Leo shouted in delight, certain he had won. He yanked hard on the rod, but strangely, the thing underwater was unusually heavy. It did not struggle or thrash like the big catfish he often caught. It just sat there, a dead weight, as if the hook had snagged on a tree root or a rock at the bottom of the pond. Annoyed, thinking he had snagged an obstacle, Leo used all his strength. He gripped the rod with both hands, braced his feet against the ground, and pulled. The fishing line grew taut like a guitar string. Slowly, the heavy object began to move, inching closer to the bank and dragging a trail of black mud with it. When the object was just a few feet from the bank, a part of it broke the surface. It was not a tree root. It was a roundish, off-white color, covered in algae and muck. Leo still could not make out what it was. He continued to pull, trying to haul it completely onto the bank. And then, when the object was right in front of him, as the water rinsed away some of the mud, a horrifying sight was revealed. It was a sight that made the 15-year-old boy let out a blood-curdling scream, drop the rod, and fall backward. It was a human skull. It was ghastly white and slimy, with 2 deep, black, empty eye sockets. To make it even more terrifying, his fishing hook was snagged securely, dangling right inside one of those sockets, as if he had just reeled in a demon from the depths of hell. Leo lay there, his eyes wide, his mouth agape, but he could not make another sound. Sheer terror had seized his chest. He scrambled backward on all fours, then shot to his feet, turned, and ran for his life, not daring to look back even once at the monster he had just pulled from the water. He ran as he had never run before, tearing through the garden and sprinting straight toward the small house nearby. He cried out for his grandpa, screaming that there was a monster in the pond. Arthur A.f.f.a.i.r, Leo's grandfather, a farmer in his late 70s with sun-darkened skin and a back bent by years of labor, was sitting on the porch whittling a piece of wood. Seeing his only grandson running toward him with a face drained of all color, he quickly stood up. He asked the boy what was wrong, questioning what kind of monster he could be talking about. Leo could not speak anymore. He could only sob and point frantically toward the pond. Seeing the absolute terror on his grandson's face, A.f.f.a.i.r knew something was terribly wrong. He dropped his whittling and rushed out to the pond, following the boy. When he arrived and saw the discarded fishing rod and the off-white object floating near the water's edge, the old man froze. Unlike his grandson, he was not scared. Instead, an endless wave of grief, a terrible truth he had tried to bury and had feared for 5 long years, suddenly crashed over him. The legs of the man who had lived nearly a full life suddenly gave way. He collapsed to his knees on the bank, buried his face in his hands, and began to cry. It was a choked, bitter sob from a father who had long suspected his son's tragic fate. He mourned his son, Michael, questioning why his life had to be so cruel. Leo was stunned, utterly confused. Michael was his father's name, the father he had been told had abandoned the family and left town when he was only 10. Why was his grandfather calling his father's name here? A.f.f.a.i.r turned and wrapped his arms around his still trembling grandson, his voice cracking. He told the boy it was not a monster. It was his daddy, his father, Michael Boudreau. The nightmare A.f.f.a.i.r had feared most had finally come true. 5 years ago, when his son suddenly vanished, his daughter-in-law, Diane Boudreau, had tearfully reported to the sheriff that her husband, deep in gambling debt, had skipped town, abandoning his wife and child. Everyone in their small community believed the story. Only he, the father who had raised Michael, never believed it for a second. His son might have been a bit wild, might have made mistakes, but he was absolutely not the kind of man who would heartlessly abandon his elderly father and the son he loved more than life itself. For 5 years, Art had lived in silent grief and suspicion. A gut feeling told him his son had met with foul play, and now, the truth had been reeled in from the very place where the crime had been concealed. After his tears ran dry, M.u.r.d.e.r shakily pulled out his old flip phone and dialed a number. He knew it was time to get justice for his ill-fated son. Receiving a report of a potential homicide, the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office responded immediately. The lead officer arriving at the scene was Detective Clay Dubois, head of the Criminal Investigation Division. Detective Dubois was a young officer but was well known for his intelligence, decisiveness, and relentless pursuit of the truth. The scene was quickly cordoned off. The skull was carefully retrieved and placed in an evidence box. Facing the law enforcement officers, M.u.r.d.e.r, though still grief-stricken, recounted the entire story with clarity. He told them about his son's sudden disappearance 5 years ago and the fabricated story of him running from debt that his daughter-in-law, Diane Boudreau, had created. Art stated with conviction that he knew she was lying. He explained that Michael had debts, but not so much that he would have to leave the state. More importantly, the day before he disappeared, Michael had shown him a winning scratch-off ticket for about $10,000. He had said he was going to pay off everything and use the rest to fix up the house. Art questioned why a man about to get a windfall and start over would run away. He was certain someone must have killed him for that money. M.u.r.d.e.r's statement provided a completely new perspective on a missing person case that had long been forgotten. Detective Clay Dubois looked down at the stagnant, black water of the pond. He knew this skull was just the beginning. The full truth of the crime from 5 years ago still lay deep beneath the cold mud. Without a moment's hesitation, he gave an order to get the fire department's rescue unit on the line. He wanted industrial pumps brought out. They were going to drain the pond. The homicide case, buried for 5 years, was now officially reopened. Detective Dubois' order was given with firm resolve. Instantly, the massive gears of the investigation began to turn. Law enforcement quickly expanded the perimeter, keeping curious neighbors from approaching the scene. Within an hour, 2 high-capacity pumps from the parish emergency rescue team were brought in. The roar of their engines shattered the hamlet's usual tranquility. 2 giant hoses were dropped into the pond. A torrent of murky, black water, thick with the smell of mud and catfish, began to be pumped out, gushing into a nearby irrigation ditch. Everyone present held their breath, their eyes fixed on the pond's slowly receding water level. They knew that beneath the deep layer of mud lay not just a skeleton, but the entire truth of a family tragedy that had been hidden for 5 years. M.u.r.d.e.r sat silently on a stool an officer had brought for him. He said nothing, his old, clouded eyes fixed on the pond as if trying to peer through the water to find the image of his lost son. Beside him, Leo had calmed down somewhat, but the horror was still visible in his young eyes. He sat close to his grandfather, seeking comfort from a truth that was too much for a 15-year-old to bear. Time passed heavily. As the water level dropped, the pond's muddy, slick banks were exposed. Then, when only a thick layer of sludge remained at the bottom, one of the rescue workers gave a signal that they had found something. Detective Dubois and the forensic officers immediately pulled on waders and stepped into the muck. Near the center of the pond, a large object wrapped in barbed wire had emerged. It lay silently at the bottom, like a sleeping monster. The officers carefully used shovels and their hands to clear away layers of mud. Then the horrifying sight was fully revealed. It was the rest of a human skeleton. It was almost completely decomposed after 5 years in the water and mud. But what was most chilling was how it had been treated. Dozens of loops of sharp barbed wire were wrapped tightly around the bones, binding it like a death cocoon. The barbed wire was then tied to a massive, cylindrical concrete object that must have weighed over 200 pounds. M.u.r.d.e.r recognized it immediately. It was an old anchor block for a boat dock, a common sight for families living by the water. But now, it had become a tool to sink a body, to ensure a crime would never surface. It was all too clear. This was a premeditated murder, carried out and concealed with extreme cruelty. The victim was not just killed, his body was desecrated, bound, and sunk in the filthiest of places. Just as the officers were carefully conducting their examination and collecting the skeletal remains, a woman came running frantically down the dirt road. It was Diane Boudreau, the victim's wife and Leo's mother. She must have been coming home from town and heard something was wrong. Seeing the swarm of sheriff's deputies, the drained pond behind her house, and especially the people in hazmat suits working with a human skeleton, Diane froze. The color drained from her face, but only for a fleeting moment. The initial shock was replaced by a perfectly rehearsed performance. She stammered, her voice trembling as she brought a hand to her mouth, asking what was happening. An officer stepped forward and briefly explained that they had found skeletal remains in the pond, believed to be her husband, M.u.r.d.e.r. Hearing this, Diane let out a gut-wrenching, theatrical wail. She cried out for her husband, Michael, questioning how he could be down there and crying out to the Lord. She shrieked and cried convulsively. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her body went limp, and she collapsed to the ground, fainting. The performance was flawless. The neighbors, who had harbored some suspicions about her over the years, now felt a pang of pity. They gathered around, some fanning her, others trying to revive her, all thinking she must have suffered an immense shock upon learning her husband had not run away but had been brutally murdered right in their own backyard. But while everyone was caught up in the tragic drama, Detective Clay Dubois stood perfectly still, watching silently. His sharp eyes never left the woman who had just fainted. With the experience of an investigator who had faced every kind of criminal, he recognized that something was off about her reaction. Her grief was too ostentatious, her wails too dramatic, and the faint came at the perfect moment. It felt like an escape, a way to avoid facing questions and the suspicious gazes of the law. His professional intuition told him that this woman was not just a victim. When Diane came to, she continued to weep, lamenting her hardship over the past 5 years, raising a son alone, waiting for a husband who would never return, never imagining he had met such a cruel fate. She tearfully recounted the story of Michael's gambling debts and his harassment by loan sharks, insisting it must have been them who killed her husband and dumped his body in the pond to cover their tracks. A day later, a preliminary DNA analysis confirmed it. The skeleton belonged to M.u.r.d.e.r. The 5-year-old missing person case was officially reclassified as a homicide. A special task force was immediately formed, headed by Detective Clay Dubois himself. Based on the initial information, especially the tearful and seemingly logical story Diane had been telling for years, the task force decided on its first line of investigation. They focused on the victim's gambling debts and conflicts. All attention turned to a notorious local loan shark, a career criminal known as One-Eye Jack Landry. According to Diane, he was the one who had repeatedly come to their house to threaten her husband before he disappeared. The path of the investigation seemed clear, the perpetrator almost identified. Yet, Detective Dubois could not shake the image of the woman and her perfect performance out of his head. A vague but persistent suspicion lingered, like a dark cloud signaling an approaching storm. With the victim's remains found and his identity confirmed, the investigation officially entered the phase of hunting for the killer. Based on Diane M.u.r.d.e.r's flawless performance and the narrative of gambling debt she had carefully constructed for 5 years, the task force's initial focus inevitably fell on M.u.r.d.e.r's shady social connections. All eyes were on the notorious local loan shark, One-Eye Jack Landry. A team of seasoned detectives was assigned to dig up every piece of information on him. One-Eye Jack's file soon landed on Detective Dubois' desk. He had a long rap sheet, with prior convictions for public disturbance, assault, and illegal gambling operations. He ran a crew of ruthless enforcers who would do anything for money. The scenario of a debtor like Michael being murdered to set an example for others was entirely plausible in that underworld. During this process, one person emerged as an incredibly active and eager source of information: Henry Boudreau, the victim's younger brother. Henry appeared devastated by his brother's death and furious at the killer. He was almost constantly at the sheriff's office, providing any tidbit of information he could to help the investigation. During one meeting, his face etched with resentment, Henry told the detectives it had to be One-Eye Jack. He could not think of anyone else. He claimed that a week before Michael disappeared, he had seen Jack with his own eyes, bringing 2 of his thugs to the house. He described how Jack smashed things, screamed at them, and threatened that if he did not get all his money back within a month, he would make his brother disappear from the face of the earth. He said Michael and Diane had to get on their knees and beg him for mercy. Henry even provided a list of his brother's gambling buddies who might have witnessed other instances of intimidation. Henry's enthusiastic cooperation initially won over the investigators. They saw him as a key witness, a younger brother doing everything he could to get justice for his slain sibling. Based on this information, the task force decided to bring in One-Eye Jack for questioning. But finding the cunning loan shark was not easy. After days of surveillance, detectives finally located him at a backwoods casino near the parish line. A raid was planned, and finally, One-Eye Jack was in custody. In the interrogation room, One-Eye Jack proved to be a worthy adversary. He was a man who had been in and out of prison multiple times and was all too familiar with police interrogation tactics. He sat with his leg crossed, the ruined left eye making his face look even more menacing, his attitude cocky and indifferent. He admitted to knowing Michael and that Michael owed him a significant amount of money. He also admitted to sending his men to check in a few times. But when asked about Michael's disappearance 5 years ago, he just scoffed. He mockingly asked if they really thought he killed him. He called Michael his golden goose, explaining that as long as Michael was alive, he could make money to pay him back. Killing him would mean losing everything. He called it bad business sense and labeled the detectives naive. When the detectives presented Henry's testimony about the death threats, One-Eye Jack burst out laughing. He admitted that threats were part of his line of work to make people pay, but threatening was one thing and doing it was another. He felt that killing a small-time debtor like Michael was not worth getting his hands dirty. The interrogation lasted for hours but yielded nothing. One-Eye Jack had a rather solid alibi. Around the time Michael disappeared, he was serving a 6-month suspended sentence and was under house arrest for another public disturbance charge. His every move was being monitored by local police. There was no way he could have been in that part of the parish to commit such a sophisticated murder and disposal. The investigation seemed to have hit another dead end. The only lead, the only suspect, had crumbled. But in that moment of frustration, a detail from the loan shark's words suddenly sparked in Detective Dubois' mind. It was not testimony, but a sarcastic remark he made as the interrogation was winding down. He had told the detectives that while his crew might be thugs, they used their heads. He found the idea of killing a guy and dumping his body in a pond right behind his own house laughable, something only idiots in movies would do because it was too obvious and risky. What if, he posed, the man's kids decided to drain the pond to catch fish one day? He guaranteed that if his crew took someone out, the body would never be found. The words of a professional criminal, though arrogant, contained an undeniable logic. That night, after releasing One-Eye Jack, Detective Dubois sat alone in his office, deep in thought. He sketched the crime scene again, noting every detail, and he realized Jack was right. A professional criminal or an experienced organization would never choose such an amateurish and risky method of body disposal. That catfish pond was too convenient, too close to home. Sinking the victim there could only have been done by someone with limited options, limited time, and most importantly, someone who had complete and unquestioned access to that area. A chilling conclusion ran down the young detective's spine. The killer was not an outsider. The killer had to be someone in the family. Once this hypothesis was formed, all the previously ambiguous details suddenly became alarmingly clear. The flawless performance by M.u.r.d.e.r. The over-the-top eagerness of the younger brother, Henry. Why was Henry so desperate to point the finger at One-Eye Jack? Was it not genuine assistance, but a deliberate act to mislead the investigation and steer attention away from the real culprits hiding in plain sight? The direction of the investigation had completely shifted. The task force secretly refocused its attention on two primary subjects, the wife, M.u.r.d.e.r, and the brother, Henry M.u.r.d.e.r. But they now faced a more formidable wall. Both of them maintained the perfect facade of grieving victims, and crucially, they had no apparent motive to kill their own family member. The case was at a standstill again, but this time, the impasse concealed a truth that was horrifying and defied all moral decency. The investigation was once again at a stalemate, but this time it was a tense and suffocating one. The task force had identified its suspects but could not find a way to break through their perfect cover. M.u.r.d.e.r continued to play the part of the grief-stricken widow, tending to memorials for her ill-fated husband. Henry M.u.r.d.e.r kept up the act of the devoted brother, frequently visiting to comfort his sister-in-law and nephew. They worked together in perfect harmony, forming a solid alliance with no visible cracks. They were the victim's only remaining family, and they were using that very status as a shield for their crime. Detective Clay Dubois felt like he was walking through a thick fog. He knew the truth was close, right in front of him, but he could not grasp it. He spent sleepless nights alone in his office, rereading every page of the case file, analyzing every statement, trying to find a single contradiction, the smallest unusual detail. But it was all in vain. The story the two suspects were living was too perfect, with no logical flaws. They lacked a motive. That was the biggest problem. Why would a wife and a brother brutally murder their own loved one? There were no property disputes or inheritance conflicts. Everything was too peaceful, and that feigned peace was their strongest fortress. In a moment of near desperation, a bold, almost crazy idea flashed through the young detective's mind. If he could not find evidence in the present, why not look to the past? A crime could be hidden, a scene could be cleaned, but relationships, emotions, and conspiracies exchanged back and forth might still be archived somewhere. A place that was invisible but real, cyberspace. The next morning, Detective Dubois called an emergency meeting. He made a proposal that was unprecedented in the history of the state's law enforcement. He proposed that they request assistance from the FBI's cyber division. The objective was to recover all deleted SMS message data from a 3-month period before the victim's disappearance from 3 phone numbers. The victim, Michael Boudreau, his wife, Diane Boudreau, and his brother, Henry Boudreau. His proposal caused a stir in the room. A veteran officer expressed his doubt, calling the request almost impossible. The data was deleted 5 years ago, making the chance of recovery practically zero. Furthermore, it would require extremely complex and expensive technology. Detective Dubois replied resolutely that he knew it was a long shot, but it was their only hope. He had a strong belief that the true nature of the relationship between these 3 people, and the motive for the murder, lay within those deleted messages. They had to try. Even with only a 1% chance, they could not afford to ignore it. The commander's determination convinced everyone. An urgent request, along with the entire case file, was sent to FBI headquarters that very day. The following days were a period of intense waiting. The task force could do little else. All overt investigative activities had to be paused to avoid tipping off the suspects. Detectives could only continue to surveil Diane and Henry from a distance. The 2 murderers seemed to have grown confident that the police had bought their story about One-Eye Jack. They went about their daily lives, their performance still perfect. Henry still visited his sister-in-law often to help out, displaying caring gestures and concerned looks for all the neighbors and young Leo to see. But they had no idea that ghosts from their past were about to be awakened. After nearly 2 long weeks, a call finally came from the FBI Cyber Division. They had succeeded. Using the most advanced techniques and technology, their experts had managed to recover a large portion of the deleted message data from 5 years ago. An encrypted file was sent to the task force. The entire team gathered in the briefing room, the air thick with tension. Detective Dubois opened the file himself. Thousands of lines of text appeared on the large screen, a chaotic jumble of characters and numbers. The sheriff's office's own tech unit began their work, decrypting, sorting, and reconstructing the conversations. They first checked the victim Michael Boudreau's messages. Nothing unusual, just work conversations and messages with friends. But when they opened the file containing the recovered data from Diane Boudreau's and Henry Boudreau's phones, a dead silence fell over the room. The truth was laid bare, a truth that was raw, depraved, and violated every tenet of morality. Between Diane and Henry was not a simple sister-in-law and brother-in-law relationship. They were lovers. The recovered messages exposed a secret, sinful affair that had been going on for a long time. Steamy messages and words of love and longing were exchanged nightly, right under the same roof as the husband and brother who had no idea. One message from Diane read, "I'm going crazy missing you, Henry. Wish you were here with me right now." Henry had replied, "Me too, Diane. I can't stand seeing you with him. I just want you all to myself." Those messages were a shock, but the real smoking gun, the definitive evidence of a motive for murder, was in the final messages sent just days before Michael was killed. It seemed their relationship had been pushed to its breaking point. From Diane, "I can't take this fake life anymore. Every time he touches me, I feel sick. We have to do something, Henry." And from Henry, "I know. Just hold on a little longer. I'm thinking of a way for us to be together forever, with no one to stop us." And the final message, as damning as a death sentence, from Diane, "I can't wait any longer. There has to be a way to end this. Now. End this." The motive for murder was crystal clear. Michael was not a husband and a brother, he was an obstacle, a roadblock that had to be removed so the adulterous couple could be together. Detective Clay Dubois clenched his hands into fists, the veins standing out on his knuckles. Disgust and rage swelled in his chest. This crime was not just a murder over debt, it was a premeditated act born from a sick, incestuous relationship. The perfect curtain of drama the two killers had put up was finally torn down by their own sinful words of love from the past. The recovered messages from the past were the trump card the task force had been waiting for. They not only provided a motive but were also a psychological weapon of immense destructive power. Detective Dubois knew that a criminal alliance built on lies and lust was as fragile as a sheet of ice. Now, he and his team would use this evidence to create a crack, and from there, shatter the entire block of sin. A detailed interrogation plan was drawn up. The core principle was to divide and conquer. They would never allow Diane Boudreau and Henry Boudreau a chance to face each other or coordinate their stories. They would attack each link in the chain separately, sowing seeds of doubt and the fear of betrayal, pushing them into a war of mutual self-destruction. The first target was Diane Boudreau. The task force reasoned that as a woman, Diane would be the psychologically weaker link, more easily shaken and hurt when confronted with the truth about her lover. The next morning, a summons was sent to Diane's house under the pretext of clarifying some details about her husband's debts. Diane arrived at the sheriff's office looking completely confident. She was still dressed in mourning clothes, her face still sad and resigned. She believed her performance was still working perfectly and that the police were still lost in the maze of debts she had created. She had no idea that a far more sophisticated trap was waiting for her. In the interrogation room, Diane was met not by Detective Dubois, but by an older, experienced female detective who specialized in questioning female subjects. This was arranged to create a sense of rapport and make the suspect lower her guard. The interrogation began gently. The female detective asked about Diane's life after her husband's disappearance and about the hardships of raising a child alone. Diane answered fluently, occasionally dabbing her eyes and lamenting her struggles and loneliness. She continued to play the part of the pitifully faithful widow. But then, the detective suddenly changed tack, asking if Diane had been in any other romantic relationships in the past 5 years. Diane was momentarily stunned by the unexpected question but quickly shook her head, stating she had only had her husband and had lived only for her son since he left. The detective pressed on, asking about her relationship with Henry, her brother-in-law. Diane replied that their relationship was good. She called him a good man who often came by to help, and she was very grateful to him. The performance had reached its peak. It was time for the curtain to fall. The female detective looked Diane straight in the eye, then pushed a folder of printed documents across the table toward her. She asked how Diane could explain these messages if her relationship was so simple. Diane looked down, and her face contorted. All her composure and confidence shattered in an instant. On the paper were her own text messages with Henry, the sinful words of love, recovered and printed in black and white. Her eyes bulged, her mouth fell open, her hands trembled uncontrollably. She stammered, asking where they got them. The detective's tone turned cold as she replied that they had their ways. She told Diane her lies were over and asked if her illicit affair with her brother-in-law was the direct cause of Michael's death. Diane panicked. She shook her head violently, desperately denying it. She claimed it was not them, that they just had feelings for a short time and did not kill Michael, insisting he really did run away. The decisive psychological blow was delivered. The female detective sighed, feigning sympathy. She questioned why Diane was still trying to cover for him. She then revealed a devastating lie. While Diane sat there defending him, in the next room, Henry Boudreau had already confessed everything. Diane was aghast. The detective continued, each word a knife stabbing into the guilty woman's heart. She claimed Henry had confessed it all, saying that Diane was the mastermind, that she could not stand being married to Michael M.u.r.d.e.r and had repeatedly pushed Henry to find a way to get rid of his own brother so they could be free. The detective said Henry claimed he was just a pawn, blinded by his love for her. He had put all the blame on her. The detective pointed out that even now, he was only thinking of himself. The attack hit its mark. The shock of being discovered was nothing compared to the feeling of being utterly betrayed by the lover she adored, the man with whom she had committed the ultimate crime. Diane's blind love quickly twisted into deep, burning hatred. Pushed into a corner, facing the prospect of taking the fall alone, her self-preservation instincts kicked in. Diane screamed, tears streaming down her face, calling him a bastard and a son of a bitch. She could not believe he would dare to say that. She called him a lowlife and declared that it was him he was the one who killed his own brother. The criminal alliance was officially broken from within. In her hysteria of betrayal, Diane Boudreau lost all reason. She shrieked and confessed everything, a truth even more horrifying than the task force had anticipated. She turned on Henry, recounting every detail of that murderous night, from being caught by Michael to Henry's brutal actions and the subsequent plan to dispose of the body. She confessed everything with a single desire: to drag the man who betrayed her down to hell with her. Diane's confession was fully recorded on audio and video. The first link in the chain was broken. The task force now had a confession from one of the two killers. The tearful and vengeful confession of Diane Boudreau was recorded in its entirety. The task force now possessed its sharpest weapon, a statement from an insider. A knife that could pierce any defense the remaining killer tried to put up. The net was half closed. It was time to catch the other big fish. Henry Boudreau was summoned to the sheriff's office shortly after, still under the pretense of providing more information. He arrived with an air of complete confidence, even a bit of smugness. He believed his plan to mislead the investigation had been a resounding success, and that the police were still chasing their tails over One-Eye Jack. He still wore the mask of a grieving brother, eager to find justice for his sibling. He had no idea that his lover, his co-conspirator, had just turned on him and that a far more brutal trap awaited. In the interrogation room, Henry was met by Detective Clay Dubois himself. He did not beat around the bush. He stated that they had enough evidence to confirm Henry and Diane were directly involved in Michael's death and asked if he had anything to say. Henry froze for a split second at the direct assault, but he quickly regained his composure. He laughed with contempt, questioning what they were talking about and demanding to see evidence. He accused them of trying to frame an innocent man, reminding them he was the one who had been cooperating the most. He sneered that since they could not find the real killer, they were now trying to pin it on the victim's family. He was tough and stubborn. He flatly denied all accusations, continuing his act. He believed that as long as he and Diane did not confess, with a 5-year-old case and no witnesses, the police could not touch them. Detective Dubois just stared silently into his eyes. He let him talk, let him expose his own deceitful nature. When Henry was done with his performance, the detective spoke slowly. He asked if Henry still trusted his lover that much and if he would like to hear what Diane had to say about him. Without waiting for a reply, Dubois signaled to another officer. The sound of a button being pressed was heard, and then, from a speaker on the table, Diane Boudreau's voice filled the room, loud and clear. Her voice screamed that he was a bastard, a lowlife, and the one who had killed his own brother. The recording continued, playing back Diane's entire confession, from the details of their illicit affair to her accusation that Henry was the brutal killer who planned the disposal. Henry Boudreau's face went rigid. His eyes widened, turning bloodshot with rage and disbelief. His confidence and stubbornness all evaporated. He was hearing the voice of the woman he loved, the woman for whom he had killed his own brother, now using that same voice to push all the blame onto him, to turn him into the sole monster. The betrayal was more painful and humiliating than being caught. When the recording ended, Henry was no longer silent. He roared like a wounded animal, a roar full of fury and hatred. He screamed and called her a bitch, slamming his cuffed hands on the table. He could not believe she would say that, insisting it was her who killed his brother. The rage shattered all his self-control. He no longer cared about denying the crime. Now, only one desire consumed him: to drag the woman who betrayed him down with him. He began to confess frantically, as if to counter-accuse Diane. And in that madness, the raw, horrifying truth of that night was finally exposed. The story Henry told matched Diane's in its outcome but was completely opposite in cause and action. According to Henry, his affair with his sister-in-law had been going on for nearly a year before the murder. It started with simple comfort and sharing, but soon, the spark ignited a fire. They fell for each other like moths to a flame. It was Diane who constantly complained about her unhappy marriage, claiming Michael was an abusive, gambling-addicted husband who ignored his wife and son. It was Diane who repeatedly hinted at a future with just the two of them. On that fateful night, Michael was supposed to be out. Henry snuck into his sister-in-law's room, and tragedy struck. While they were in bed together, Michael came home unexpectedly early. The bedroom door flew open. Michael stood there, frozen, witnessing the unbelievable sight of his wife and his own brother in the same bed. The rage of a betrayed man erupted. Michael lunged at Henry. The two brothers, men who shared the same blood, fought like mortal enemies. Michael, being bigger and stronger, quickly gained the upper hand, pinning his younger brother to the floor. It was in that moment that the tragedy was sealed by a third party. Diane Boudreau, in a state of sheer panic, feared that if Michael killed Henry, or if the affair was exposed, her life would be ruined. In that split second, she stopped thinking. She only knew she had to silence Michael. She looked around and grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a tire iron Michael kept in the closet. Without a shred of hesitation, she used all her strength to swing the iron, bringing it down hard on the back of her husband's head as he was still struggling with his brother. A sickening thud echoed in the room. Michael froze. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by a look of pained astonishment. He slowly turned his head to look at the woman who had been his wife for years, and then he collapsed, motionless. Both Henry and Diane were stunned. The death was so sudden, so unexpected. But panic was quickly replaced by the cold calculation of concealing their crime. The death was spontaneous, but the disposal was premeditated. They knew they could not leave the body in the house. The catfish pond behind the garden became the perfect choice. To ensure the body would never surface, Henry came up with the idea of using the barbed wire and the heavy concrete block. Together, under the cover of darkness, they carried out their gruesome task. They wrapped Michael's body in dozens of loops of barbed wire, then struggled to roll the heavy concrete block to the pond's edge. They tied the body to the block and, with their combined strength, pushed it into the deep water. A loud splash, and then everything was silent again. The next day, to complete their charade, Diane went to the sheriff's office and tearfully reported the story of her husband running away from his debts, a story they had concocted together that night. The confessions of the two killers, though contradictory in blaming each other, formed a complete and horrifying picture of an unforgivable crime. A crime born of lust and betrayal, ending in a family tragedy that could never be repaired. The confessions of both Diane Boudreau and Henry Boudreau, though filled with contradictions in their attempts to blame one another, when pieced together, created a complete and undeniable picture of a horrifying crime. The investigation was officially closed, but the aftershocks it left behind would ripple outward for a long, long time. The story of the incestuous affair between a sister-in-law and brother-in-law that led to the murder of their own brother and husband sent a massive shockwave through the small, peaceful community. People could not believe that behind the doors of what seemed like an ordinary family lay such a gruesome tragedy. Trust between neighbors was fractured, and whispers and rumors crept into every home, turning the story into a horrifying local legend told with a shudder. Several months later, the St. Martin Parish District Court opened the trial for the two defendants, Diane Boudreau and Henry Boudreau. The trial drew intense public interest. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with both outrage and sorrow. In the defendant's box, the two who were once passionate lovers, who had defied all morality for each other, now sat far apart, looking at each other as mortal enemies. Throughout the trial, they never once made eye contact. Diane's gaze was sometimes vacant, sometimes flashing with hatred when she heard Henry testify. Henry, on the other hand, was sullen, his head bowed, though he would occasionally steal a glance at his former lover with a look full of resentment and contempt. The sinful love was dead, only hatred and the effort to blame the other to save themselves remained. With solid evidence from the discovered skeleton and the forensic report to the recovered text messages and, most importantly, their two detailed confessions, the trial proceeded quickly. The district attorney proved irrefutably that regardless of who struck the final blow, both defendants were equally responsible for Michael's death as co-conspirators. Their actions were not just murder but the ultimate betrayal of the victim, a trampling of the most basic moral values of a family. The most heart-wrenching moment of the trial was when Leo Boudreau was called to the stand as a witness. The 15-year-old boy, who had inadvertently fished up the entire tragedy, now had to stand in court and face his mother and his uncle, the people who had murdered his father. He was thinner and paler. The immense pain and shock seemed to have stripped him of all his childhood innocence. He answered the court's questions in a low murmur, his eyes never daring to look directly at the two defendants. To him, they were no longer his mother and uncle. They were strangers, demons who had taken everything from him. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. The presiding judge, in a stern voice, declared that the actions of the defendants were exceptionally cruel and devoid of humanity. Stemming from an illicit relationship that went against all common decency, the defendants had ruthlessly taken the life of their own husband and brother. Not only that, but they had disposed of the victim's body in a barbaric manner and constructed a deceitful charade for 5 years, causing irreparable pain to an elderly father and a young child. This crime, he stated, must be punished with the most severe sentence. The court passed sentence. For the crime of first-degree murder with aggravating factors of cruelty and depravity, both defendant Diane Boudreau and defendant Henry Boudreau received the same sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, both defendants collapsed. Diane wailed hysterically, while Henry sat frozen in silence. But it was all too late. The prison gates had closed on their lives, but the tragedy they created remained. The case was closed, but the pain would never fade. The most painful and ironic tragedy belonged to the very person who brought the crime to light. Leo Boudreau, on a simple afternoon of fishing, had bravely sought the truth and brought justice to his deceased father. But the price he paid was far too high. He had lost his father forever, and now he had lost his mother and uncle to the prison system. He became an orphan, adrift in the world, left in the care of his frail, elderly grandfather. What would become of the boy, who had to grow up with the horrifying memory that his own fishing hook had sent his mother and uncle to prison? It was a terrible psychological burden, a scar that would follow him for the rest of his life. The case of the catfish pond would forever be remembered as one of the most painful family tragedies. It is a cautionary tale about the consequences of lust and betrayal, and a sorrowful testament to the fact that sometimes justice, when served, does not bring peace, but only leaves behind an even greater pain.